All right, folks, it is 6 o'clock Eastern, and we're going to go ahead and get started for this month's webinar. I am Dr. Adam Ingrao with the Heroes to Hives program and Michigan Food and Farming Systems, and our MIFS Vets and Ag Network is who is hosting tonight's webinar along with Heroes to Hives. And this is a webinar series that we started last month that we're going to be continuing throughout the season, basically on Aja hives or Slovenian AZ hives and different aspects of Slovenian AZ hives. And so tonight's lecture is going to be on building a Slovenian style bee house, also known as a Čebelnjak. And this lecture basically is going to build on some of the principles that we talked about in the first lecture and really get into kind of the nuts and bolts of what you should be considering if you are thinking of doing something like this. I will say right up front, this is a different style of beekeeping than we keep in the United States. So not only is there the necessity for different styles of equipment, in this case, a building. There are also the management practices are very different than they are with a Langstroth hive. And the thing you should always be keeping in mind when you're thinking about Aja hives in particular is that it's always fixed space. So you don't have the ability to just throw a super on when you need more space like we do with Langstroth hives. So it is a different style of beekeeping. And there'll be other videos in this series later on in the year where we'll get into the management components and things you should be thinking about for management. But in this lecture, we're going to be talking specifically about the building that these Aja hives are housed in. Now, I will also preface this that I do have one of these myself. We'll be talking about kind of my own journey with Aja hives as far as the building that we have here on our farm that we use for apitherapy, agritourism, all sorts of different things. But I will also kind of I'm going to give you basically the whole layout of how we built that out, what it cost us, so that you have an idea of something of that size and scale and what that would cost. But I do want to just let you know that there are, much cheaper ways of going about this. If you are good with woodworking, you can easily make one of these hives. If you are a contractor or know somebody that's real handy, building your own building is always an option. So there's varied things that you can do to decrease costs. What I'll be showing you in this particular example in this lecture is I'll be showing you kind of what we did, which was basically we purchased everything. The only thing we did as far as construction was finish work and, insulation and things like that. But we didn't actually build the building. We didn't build the hives. So just keep that in mind as we're talking about this as we're going through today's lecture. Kind of house cleaning items before we really dive into this. Please keep yourself muted throughout the lecture. You can have your camera on or off. That's up to you. But if you do have questions, feel free to drop those in the chat. We will have some time at the end for questions, but I won't stop during the lecture to pause and answer questions. But you don't want to forget what you were going to ask, so just drop it right in the chat. And what I'll do is I'll revisit all of the chat questions at the end and address all of those. All right, so let's go ahead and get started then. All right. All right, so what is a bee house? So what are we talking about when we're talking about a bee house? Well, this is a traditional Slovenian beekeeping structure. This is something that has been used in that country for hundreds of years and started really way before we started keeping Langstroth's hives in the United States. But in the 1700s, actually, you see buildings like this. This is from Attendees' historical site. This is actually a very historic site in Slovenia. Attendees is widely considered the father of modern beekeeping education and one of the first people to actually start documenting and teaching beekeeping. And so this is his place, but this is a traditional bee house. Now, the hives in this particular house are known as Carnolian hives. They are not Aja hives, but this is where kind of the concept of keeping bees inside of a building began in Slovenia. And when the Aja hive began to be developed in the late 1800s, early 1900s, what we saw was that the country had become so accustomed to these bee structures, these bee houses, that the Aja hive was actually incorporated into this. And so this is a historical piece of Slovenian culture that has actually spanned two different styles of beehives, and is now used for Aja hives. These house the hives themselves. And so you actually are, you're putting your bees inside of the house itself. This is very different than a Langstroth colony. And if you, for those of you, I see a lot of familiar faces. If there is anybody that's new to beekeeping and has never kept bees in a Langstroth colony, the Langstroth colonies, the beauty of Langstroth design is the ability to maximize the amount of honey that you can put on while minimizing the amount of extraction that you've got to do. That's very different with Aja hives because they're in a house. And so you don't have the ability to just keep going up, up, up. At some point, you have a limit of height. And so you do have to extract more, you manage the hives more, those types of things. But these literally house the hives. Now, the one thing that you are going to see that's different with Aja hives and part of the design of the bee house is that you're going to be accessing these from the rear. So you work the hives from inside of the building, which means there's some special things that you have to pay attention to when you're designing out how you're going to keep your bees in a building and what that building should look like. The rear access management and having that in the forefront of your mind when you're building out or designing out one of these buildings is really important because you want the ability to move freely behind that hive. You want the ability to walk back. You want the ability to have materials behind you, maybe a table or something like that. You're going to need space around you. And so knowing that you're going to be accessing from the rear, that comes into the design considerations. These bee houses, they offer weather protection. I think one of the coolest things about having Aja hives is the ability to work bees in bad weather. I live in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. We have bad weather constantly. And I mean, last year, for example, I didn't really get to work bees the whole month of June because it just rained the entire month. But in an Aja house, in one of these bee houses, I can work those bees when need be. And so I'm not limited by the weather, which is really nice. And it also adds an extra layer of protection to your hives because now they're inside of a building in addition to being inside of a beehive itself. It also offers some level of predator protection, and we'll talk a little bit about pests and what to consider when you're working with one of these bee houses. But it does offer a layer of protection. It's not going to stop a bear, and I don't want anybody to think that my Aja house is behind a bear fence. It will not stop a bear, but it'll stop a lot of your nuisance pests like raccoons, skunks, things like that. So that is something to keep in mind as well, as it does offer a layer of protection for that. So why build a bee house? And this is something, if you're a beekeeper right now and you have, Langstroth equipment or, some variation of that, or maybe you're keeping long Langstroths or Kenyan top bars or whatever it is, it's one of the things to keep in mind when you're going into this whole, kind of pathway of getting into Aja hives and keeping bees in these bee houses is that there are, really significant advantages, I think, of working with Aja hives. The biggest one being the reduced heavy lifting. I know I see a lot of familiar faces on here, so some of you know me, but some of you don't. I have several injuries, both from the military and from a very bad car accident that happened in 2021, which has dramatically impacted my ability to lift. So much so that this year we've actually sold off all of our 10 frame deep equipment, and I have converted almost all of my hives to 8 frame medium only because of my lifting restrictions are getting worse and worse with my disabilities as I age. And so the idea that we can reduce the heavy lifting is the most attractive feature of working with Aja hives. So that's a big thing to keep in mind. The most you're ever going to lift with an Aja hive is literally one deep frame, which at the very most, full of honey, is going to weigh about 9 pounds. That's the absolute most you're going to ever lift. I have pictures of me back in my heyday of beekeeping, 15, 20 years ago when I was feeling real good and before my car accident, standing next to towers of Langstroth colonies that are 11 or 12 boxes deep. And so I was able to do that back then, but working above my head now is not possible. So this is a big reason why moving to Aja hives and a bee house was for me. It also improves the comfort of the beekeeper. Being not being out in blazing heat, and I know some of you are, in lower latitudes than me. We don't get very hot up here in the UP, but I am also from Southern California originally and kept bees in Central California in triple digit heat in the middle of the summer. And having a shelter or something over me while I'm keeping bees, getting out of that heat, oh my gosh, I mean, you talk about comfort. That's amazing, especially when you're wearing a bee suit, to have that level of comfort. In an Aja house, when I was in Slovenia in 2014 or 2024, I mean, some beekeepers got fans in the bee house because you can. I mean, it's a nice environment to work in. Better overwintering protection. And this is something that I plan on doing some research projects on this year, especially with overwintering, is determining what kind of overwintering success we have in comparison to our Langstroth colonies. The research that's out there is kind of nebulous in this area because there really hasn't been a side-by-side comparison in the United States between Langstroth and Aja hives. But everything tells me, as an entomologist, as someone who's been keeping bees for a couple decades, everything's been telling me just from the design and just from what I've put into this that you are going to see better overwintering. Now we have very minimal losses in our apiary to begin with. Usually about 15% at the absolute most. But what I would like to see in these colonies and what I expect to see them from overwintering is I expect to see lower honey consumption because honey consumption is correlated to temperature, and we are regularly below zero up here in the UP. So if I can keep them at a warmer temperature, that means that they're going to consume less honey to thermoregulate. So that's a big plus, and I can see that happening in an insulated building that's in an insulated hive. So these are things that I believe will be teased out in research here in the next couple of years. But it is something that I truly believe, and what I was being told in Slovenia by very experienced beekeepers with that hive system. The other thing to keep in mind is none of us are getting any younger. And a lot of folks, get into beekeeping as kind of like a second career or a hobby after retirement, those types of things. And so that's also something to keep in mind is this is excellent if you're an aging beekeeper or if you're dealing with disabilities because of how accessible the hives are and being in a building adds another layer of comfort and security as well. Rather than being out in some field, keeping bees in Langstroth colonies, you're in a building with a level floor, no tripping hazards, those types of things that make the beekeeping much safer as well. And then the other thing that maybe you want to consider is apitherapy. This is a very big thing in Eastern Europe. It's big here in the United States in small circles. If you're interested in apitherapy, I highly recommend the American Apitherapy Society. They put on a conference every year. Lacey, who many of you know is the co-founder, my partner is the co-founder of Heroes to Hives, is the person who puts on the conference for AAS. So if you're interested in that type of thing, using bees as wellness, that is what a lot of these structures are used for in Slovenia, is specifically for apitherapy. So things like honey massages, air therapy, meaning you go in and you actually breathe the bee air from the hives themselves, venom therapy. So these types of different acoustic therapy. So these are things that are integrated into a lot of these bee houses, particularly in Slovenia and here in my bee house as well. We have the same type of thing incorporated where we do air therapy, venom therapy, acoustic therapy, those types of things as well. So that may be one of the reasons you're considering building a bee house. These are things that are not really easy to do with Langstroth colonies. I have seen bee houses with Langstroth colonies, and a lot of them, we have a friend up here who has one, and basically his Langstroth colonies are on like a drawer that goes underneath the building and then comes out. I think it's one of those drawers that you use in like the back of a pickup truck that has a real heavy load capacity. So that's another alternative to get the bees underneath you. But the nice thing about the Aja hives is they are incorporated into the bee house themselves. Now, the basic layout for a hive house is going to be your hives are going to be facing outside. That should be pretty clear to you. This is what the inside looks like. So the inside here, you've got your beehives all set up here. This is Mission Believe out of Maryland. Some friends of ours who we've worked with extensively over the years also run a veterans and first responders beekeeping education program. This is their hive house, and basically, what you can see is they've set this up really nicely. They've got a bed up top so that someone can sleep in there to get air therapy, to get the vibrational therapy. And then you have the ease of working these hives that are on an elevated table. That's the nice thing also when you're building these out is you can set these, dimensions to whatever works perfectly for you. You can also see they have a little bed next to it as well. So you want the hives facing outdoors. The interior inspection corridor is something you really need to keep in mind. So like I said, this big space behind you, you want to make sure you have lots of space to work when you are working in these buildings. You are going to be moving around. You're going to be pulling frames out and putting them down somewhere. There are, specialized frame holders. I think I have one in a picture here coming up that we use for Aja frames, but those are things to keep in mind as you want to have that space around you. In addition, storage and work areas are really important to keep in mind. Storage is something that you probably are going to want if you're running both Langstroth colonies and Aja colonies. Most of the times the frames don't mix and match, and so you're going to have a set of Aja equipment and you're going to have a set of Langstroth equipment. It's nice to have storage in your building, extra frames, things like that, so you can get a hold of them when you need to. A work area is also really nice. One of the things that I saw a lot of in Slovenia, and you'll see in the next picture here, you'll see a glimpse of this in the background, is an extractor. A lot of these hive houses incorporate extraction equipment. And the reason is because, again, you don't have the ability to expand these colonies. When you get honey on and it's in the colony, you got to get that out to free up space so more honey can be put on, mainly so that you don't get yourself in a backfilling situation that ends up in a swarm. And so you need to constantly be working these hives about every 7 to 10 days, and you are constantly harvesting honey during the honey season. It's not like Langstroth where you may just harvest once or twice a year. Typically, you're harvesting as it comes in with these hives, again, because you have limited space. Other things that we see in basic layouts of these hive houses, beds and chairs, something like you see in this picture, or just a chair near the colonies. And then roof overhangs is another thing that most of these buildings incorporate, and that's just an overhang that kind of goes right over the hives, just to make sure that the elements are coming right down on the front of the hive on the outside of the building. All right, as far as dimensions go, so as far as the ceiling dimensions, and this is the picture that I just mentioned here, this is at the Paraplegic Beekeepers Association in Slovenia, and you can see these gentlemen are going through this entryway, and you can see in the background there's a wax spinner and an extractor back there. So that's in the actual bee house right there. So dimensions you want to be thinking about when you're thinking about constructing one of these. Ceiling height is really important. You want it to be comfortable to work in. You don't want low ceilings. You want to have enough ability to move around and be able to move equipment around easily. So having at least a 7-foot ceiling is really nice. When it comes to the actual dimensions of the building itself, as far as the size, the square footage, that is entirely up to you, and it should be based on the number of colonies that you're going to be putting in there. If you plan on putting, 50 Aja hives in a building, you're going to need a pretty good sized building. The building that I have is a 10 by 20 building, and it has 10 full-size hives in it and 5 nukes. So just to give you an idea. But if you're only doing a couple hives, you can get away with a very small building. It does not have to be a big building. Something that's like if you're doing a couple hives, something that's as small as like a 5 by 10 or something like that might be all you need. And you may not need a building at all. And we'll talk about that in just a couple slides, that there are some alternatives to get around having an actual building. But if you are looking at a building, make sure the doors are at least 3 feet wide. You want to be able to make sure to get all your equipment in and out easily. You can see this has double doors on it, which is really nice, especially if you're dealing with somebody that has mobility restrictions. So maybe wheelchair or walker, having the extra width is really nice to get in and out of those doors. You always want to make sure behind the hives, so the walkway behind the hives, the interior corridor, you want to make sure you have at least 4 to 5 feet behind those hives. And that's just to make it easy to move, make it easy so that you're not just crammed in there trying to work bees. It's not going to be any fun if you put yourself in a really cramped situation when the whole purpose of it was to make things more accessible. So that's something to keep in mind as well. If you're doing ramps, which is also something that's really nice, depending on if you have a mobility restriction or if you just don't want to have to use steps when you're going up into your building. Ramps are really nice. The ADA measurements is so 1 inch of slope for every 12 inches of length. So if you are going to do something like that, I just put that on there just so you have that. But it is nice to make sure, one of the things I'm always concerned about with myself and a lot of the folks that I work with, especially those of us that have brain injuries, because like after my brain injury, sometimes it feels like I'm walking on like a waterbed. The vestibular system just doesn't have the balance that it used to. And so having a ramp instead of like a walking upstairs or something like that, especially if I'm holding equipment, boy, that's just really nice. Okay. So site selection. So some of the things that you should be thinking about for site selection when you're thinking about getting a building and setting all of this up, because this is a big commitment. This isn't like just buying a couple and Langstroth hives and having some beekeeping fun. This is it's an investment and a commitment. So morning sunlight exposure, always a good idea. Southern facing apiaries is ideal. It does not have to be southern facing, but it is nice if you can get it. But the thing I always tell folks, especially northern beekeepers, you just don't want it facing north, especially if you get real winters. 'Cause those northern winds, boy, they are brutal here in the UP. You want a dry elevated location. You do not want this to be in moist areas. You're putting a building up, granted, like some of these modular buildings, you might be able to move with a tractor or something like that. But for the most part, this is going to be kind of a permanent location. If you put these things in soggy locations, you can end up getting things like chalk brood and things like that that are just related to wetness. And so making sure that this is in an elevated, dry location is just good idea for a building site. You want good drainage, so soils that are not heavily soggy. So if you live in an area that has really heavy clay, make sure that you're not putting this in somewhere where everything just pools when we get into the spring thaw. You want to make sure you have good wind protection. So just because it's in a building doesn't mean that you don't want to still keep wind in mind. You don't want that prevailing wind just hammering down on the front of your hives. You want to make sure that you're conscious of which direction your wind's coming from, and you offer some protection for that. And then the other thing is, and this is something that, if you live in an urban area or an area that has a neighborhood, or maybe you live in a neighborhood and you're not out in the rural country, or maybe you're doing this at like a university. This picture right here is at the University of Ljubljana in Slovenia. And so this is at an academic institution. And when they put this in here, you can actually see in the picture right behind here is a pedestrian walkway, but they've faced the hives facing the opposite direction from the walkway so that people aren't interacting with the hives. So if you are going to do something like that, where you are in an area where pedestrian traffic could be an issue, just make sure that you're not facing this thing towards the pedestrian traffic. Just like you would with your Langstroth colonies, the way you direct them is the way the bees are going to come out. They're going to fly like 30 to 50 feet, climb rapidly, orient themselves, and be on their way. But if you're pointing them at somebody, those 30 to 50 feet of interaction can sometimes be a kind of a nuisance for folks. So just keep that in mind. Now, foundation options. So getting into your building options as far as foundations, there's a lot of different options here, and you can get as creative as you want, because the fact of the matter is you're not going to be able to buy a building that's ready for Aja hives from anybody in the United States. You're going to have to build this or have somebody modify something for you, manufacture something for you, or you're going to modify something yourself. But here are kind of your options when you're thinking about foundations for one of these buildings. One, is concrete. You can do a concrete slab, and it is the picture you saw of the hive house in Maryland. That's on a concrete slab. It's a beautiful building. It's a stick-built building. It is gorgeous, and they did a great job on that. So if that's something you want to do, that's an option. Build it just like you would build a house. Pavers, if you want to do something a little more simple, that's not concrete, pavers can be an option. You level out a floor, and then build around those pavers, or put the pavers inside of a dirt floor building, something like that. Pier foundation. So if you want to use posts in order to set a foundation and have this a little elevated on pier posts, you can do that. A gravel pad is another option. If you're using something like a modular building, which is what we'll be talking about here in just a bit, the gravel pad is really nice because you can level it out and then you just set the building right on top of it. It also offers a level of drainage as well when you pad out one of these with gravel. You can do trailer mounted, which is what you see here. So this is a trailer. There's not a trailer on here, but this is how this moves. So basically, this is a mobile bee unit. This is a commercial beekeeper in Slovenia, down near the Italian border. And basically, what they do is they have a flatbed trailer that goes underneath of this, and then you can see the legs are telescoping. The legs telescope down, sets right onto the trailer, and they're off. So you have a trailer mounted setup at that point. For migratory beekeeping in Slovenia, which is, it's a thing. It's not as big as it is in the United States as far as numbers, but it's a significant part of their beekeeping economy. This is a very common thing that you see. Truck mounted also, I saw those as well when I was out there, where they basically have kind of panel trucks that have been adjusted basically to have hives on the back end of them. But in both situations, you're working from the inside in those situations. Now, I said that you do not have to have just the inside version of this, right? Since you are going to be making something or having someone manufacture something or adapting something that already exists to house your hives, you can get creative, and you do not have to have a building option if you don't want to. And this is a prime example. This is a gentleman near Lake Bled, and basically what he has done is he's developed this. It's basically like a big cabinet that sits outside. What you don't see is there's actually a back to this, so that folds down over the backs of the hives. And when he wants to work them, it folds up and creates a canopy for himself. So it's really kind of a narrow, all made from square bar, so it's all made from steel, and basically made a cage for it, and it has a folding door on the back of it. Completely custom made, and something that anybody could do, right? So if you have access to a welder and somebody that's good at that, you could build one of these yourselves, or a fabricator that could do something like this. It's not a very complex construction. And when it comes to metal fabrication, it's pretty simple. So this is something that's totally doable, and you could do this on a small scale. Like if you wanted two of these, Aja hives, you could put two right next to each other, have a little frame built around that, and then have a cabinet door on the back of it that either opens up or folds open. So this is an option. The thing about the Aja hives, though, is you do not want them outdoors. You do not want the hive itself exposed to the elements. It needs to be in something. But there are different options other than buildings as well. This talks about the hive house, so we're going to focus on that. But I just wanted to put that out there, that there are non-building options for this. Something really simple. I was at EAS. Oh goodness, it's been a few years ago. It was when it was in Maryland, and there was a gentleman who I was doing a class there on therapeutic beekeeping, and a gentleman let us use one of the hives that they had in their demonstration area that was an Aja hive. And it was two Aja hives stacked on top of each other in what looked like, to me, like a phone booth, like an old phone booth. It wasn't a real phone booth, but that was the dimensions of it. It was like a phone booth. And he had two Aja hives in there. So that's an option too. All right. So let's go to building materials. So if we are going back to the building, so you have a couple options. You can do a stick-built building. This can be something you build yourself, or something you can hire someone out to do, or you can do the prefab route. Now, I will say that in today's kind of construction economy, the prefabricated, and I believe, is a much cheaper route to go and much more readily available. So depending on where you're at and how construction's going right now, up here in the UP, we have contractors. There's not a whole lot of them, but getting on a list to get something custom built oftentimes is a year or more of wait to get something built. So prefab is everywhere up here. Lots of people use them for cabins, all that kind of stuff. So that's what we went with. But you have that option. If you want to do stick built and you want to have something custom made to exactly what you want, that's awesome. I'm happy for you, and I hope it turns out really, really well. Because if we had the ability to do that, we might have done that too. So that's something to keep in mind. Roofing. So depending on where you are, make sure that the roof that you put on this thing is something that you would put on your house. Like I want you to understand that like you don't want to put a bunch of cheap materials into these types of buildings because you're going to be housing very expensive beehives in them if you purchase them from somebody that's manufactured them. You're going to be putting very expensive beekeeping equipment in there. And the whole intention of doing this is one of the intentions is keeping your woodenware forever. When I was in Slovenia, we were working hives that were 40, 50 years old, and they looked nothing like what my Langstroth hives look like that are 10, 15 years old. So there is a difference there when it comes to making sure that you're investing into this and not being like Elizabeth or Trent. I'm not sure which one it says. Don't be cheap. Get what you're paying for. And this is something that's kind of special. So make sure you're doing it the right way. But roofing is something that's really important. You want to make sure that it's adequate roofing. And if you live in snow country, make sure it can handle the snow load that you have. I mean, we see collapsed buildings up here every single year. We had 218 inches of snow this year here in Newberry, and collapsed buildings all over the place. And so the last thing you would want to do is construct something that you put all of your love and care and bees into, and then middle of the winter, the whole darn thing collapses on you. So make sure you're paying attention to that. Siding, options, stuff that's vinyl siding, everything from that to like you see this gentleman here has a cedar face on his hives or his building. So things to think about when it's coming to the building there too. All right. Let's get into the actual construction materials and what we should be doing with these particular buildings. So number one is insulation and ventilation, two very important aspects of Aja hives and the buildings that house them. So moisture management is really critical. One of the things that you may not be thinking of, but if you live in northern climates and you've taken the Heroes Dive course, I hope you know, is that bees put off a tremendous amount of moisture over the winter. 100 pounds of honey, consumption of 100 pounds of honey over the course of a winter equates to about 4 gallons of water that comes off through respiration. That's a ton. That is literally almost a 5 gallon bucket of water that has to go somewhere over the course of the season. Now, when you're building these out, one of the things you want to make sure with moisture management is that it's being managed, number one, appropriately. And part of that is through ventilation, part of it's through insulation. So when we talk about insulation, the entire building, if you're in northern climates, and let me preface that because I am a northern beekeeper. I teach Midwest beekeeping programs, but if you're from a southern state, this is not as critical. But if you live in areas that have winter, where bees go through sustained months of non-flight and pure consumption on honey, moisture is critical. And so making sure that you have somewhere for this moisture to go is really important. So ridge vents, soffit vents. We have on our building, and I think you'll see them in the next picture, I have vents that are put at the peaks of both ends so that I can open up during the winter. Windows, those types of things are important to vent moisture. With Aja hives, they're ventilating into the building. So when they're ventilating, that moisture is coming into the building. So you want to make sure that you're managing that appropriately. And one of the worst things you could do is always remember that moisture condenses on cold surfaces. So if you don't have an insulated ceiling and you have insulated walls in your building, that moisture is going to start condensing on the ceiling. in your building. So you need to make sure that when you insulate this thing, you're insulating the whole thing around. Again, if you were in northern climates. Cross ventilation is also really important. Like I said, we have we have vents at both ends of the building, and then we also have windows as well, just to make sure that we're dealing with moisture when it comes up and when it gets really severe. And it tends to be really severe when bees are consuming the most amount of honey, which typically is during the coldest part of the year. So that's when you're going to be dealing with that. Lighting and electrical. So lighting is really important. You need to make sure that you're putting lighting in mainly because you got to be able to see, right? I mean, you're doing these inspections. Now, things to keep in mind about lights and I should say windows for that matter. Bees are going to be flying in this building. You're going to be pulling frames out. There's going to be bees flying around. And the way that bees orient, always remember, like when they leave the hive, what is the first thing they do? They orient themselves to the landscape and they use the sun as part of that orientation. The thing that they're going to do when they leave the interior of the hive is that they are going to go straight for any kind of light. So windows like you see on these doors right here, they will attract right to that. And that's because they're basically trying to orient to the sun. When they're moving in that building, that's where they're going to go. They're not going to go just right to the roof. They're going to go right to the windows. So if you have windows in your building, make sure that you're putting something over those windows. So like a blackout cloth or something like that to make sure that the bees are not going to the windows, but rather going where you want them to. So when you're working these colonies, you tend to have the door open and the windows basically covered. And that's what they're doing is they're going right out the door and they'll make their way right back to the hive. And so that is something that you want to make sure you have, but you do need to have lighting. You do need to be able to see. Now, maybe that's a headlamp for you. Maybe you don't want to have electrical in this building, or maybe it's in a place that's so remote that you can't get electrical there. Those types of accommodations can be made too, a flashlight, something like that. But good lighting is always really good. I wear progressive lenses, and so I don't have the greatest eyes. Lighting's always something that's like the forefront of my mind when it comes to beekeeping. Electrical outlets. So if you're going to want to run an extractor, if you're going to want to run a fan, if you want to run a scale, meaning a hive scale, that you're measuring your weight of your hives. That's a very common practice in Slovenia, mainly because you have fixed space. So they like to know when nectar's coming in, and they do that with scales. Or if you're doing air therapy and you have masks that are hooked up to fans that are hooked up to your hives, which we have in our place, you need electrical for that. So think about if you're going to be able to do solar or if you're going to hardwire something. These are different, solutions for the same problem, which is getting electricity. This type of a building is very accommodating for solar. If you don't have the ability to get hardwire out there, a solar panel or a couple solar panels can do just about everything you're going to probably want to do in a hive house. So that's something to keep in mind. Accessibility. This is something that I talk a lot about in all of my talks, and something that is really close to my heart because I'm a disabled vet and I work with a lot of disabled vets. So accessibility is kind of always the forefront of my mind. Some of the things you can keep in mind when you're designing something like this out, keep the wide aisles. Wide aisles are really accommodating for everybody. Having a little extra space is really nice. Seats for working hives. One of the things that we have in our place, I have a little like mechanics seat on rollers that has a little back to it that is telescoping. We got it from Harbor Freight, just rolling around right between my hives. That's really nice and comfortable. So that's something. Anti-fatigue mats, if you're dealing with a setup where you're going to be standing instead of in a seated position, having those anti-fatigue mats underneath you can be really helpful, especially if you're dealing with ankle, knee, or back injuries. Ramps, like you see here in this picture, this is a ramp that's coming up from one surface, which is pavers, up into the Otta house, and they had this nice plated or nice plate here so that you didn't have to make that step, but rather it was a nice just gradual slope. Again, really nice. Grab bars. Grab bars are also something to think about. If you're going to be working with individuals who are using wheelchairs or walkers or just have, difficulty standing and sitting, having grab bars that are mounted near the hive so that you can have someone sit down or, lay down in a bed that's in front of the hives and be able to get up easily. That's a nice accommodation as well. All right, so pest management. Now, this is something that is the pests that we deal with are going to be the same pests that we typically have in a lot of situations with bees. There's just a little bit of a different way of thinking about them. And so let's talk about this. The number one pest, as far as a different kind of that's going to be impacting your colonies more as a nuisance pest than anything, and this is something really common in these hive houses, is ants. You have honey, you have sweet stuff, you have a bunch of bees. They're in a confined space. These hives are basically stacked next to each other. So there's a thin in between them sometimes, the space that ants like to get into. They're really hard to keep out of these houses, especially during the middle of the season when, there's just a ton of nectar coming in and really sweet smells everywhere. It's really hard to keep them out. So that's something to think about. The thing that I want to kind of impress upon you is there's different solutions for this, and it can be super sophisticated or it can be not as sophisticated. And, I mean, something as simple as like using ant poison, like the bait traps, that could be something that you use. This picture right here is a little more of an innovative solution. This is at the paraplegic beekeepers in Slovenia, and you can see this is their hive house right here. And what they actually created around the entire hive house is a moat. So there's a little moat all the way around the hive house specifically to keep ants out. So that is a really clever idea. If I had the funding to do something like that, I'd probably do it just so that I could say I had a moat around my bee house. That is one solution, but there's a lot of other solutions. Diatomaceous earth typically is what I would be using. Diatomaceous earth is totally safe. Yeah, I mean, there's food grade diatomaceous earth that we use in some foods, but it is a totally safe thing to have around bees as long as you're not dusting the bees with it. But you can create barriers around your hives with it, so that's something to think about. Mice, because it's a building, you may if you're not, things aren't being kept clean. If you've got some areas that are like confined and kind of tucked away and don't get a lot of attention, mice can become an issue. Wax moths, just like with regular beekeeping equipment, wax moths can become an issue in Aja houses. And the worst wax moth infestation I have ever seen was in an Aja hive. Something that I had actually very intimate experience with that particular hive. And so wax moths, just like any kind of storage pest, wax moths typically are looking for things that have pollen in them. So if you leave frames sitting in the hive house that just have pollen in them and are not in colonies, that is something that can attract wax moths. Raccoons, this is really a good solution for a lot of issues with raccoons. I've seen raccoons do some pretty gnarly stuff with beehives, up to like tearing them apart, that even stuff that's been ratchet strapped. So raccoons are pretty clever individuals, but in a building like this, they tend to not be as much of an issue. Bears, though, if you live in bear country, you still have to put a bear fence around this. I have had situations in the past with clients of mine, not with Aja hives, but with Langstroth hives, that have actually been in buildings and the bears have actually broken into the buildings, like ripped the barn wall off to get to the hive. So, this type of a building, the last thing you would want to do is invest all this money into it and then a bear come and make, a huge hole in the side of your building. So, something to keep in mind. Biosecurity, and this is the frame stand I was talking about earlier. Biosecurity is something that is always at the forefront of my mind when it comes to making sure my bees are staying healthy and that there is nothing coming in to affect them. So, washable surfaces is a nice thing to have in these buildings. So, the floors, making sure that you're not on carpet or something like that, but rather have something that you can clean. If it gets contaminated. And by that, what I mean is like if you have a colony that has, European foul brood and you set those frames down on the floor and then you set other frames from another hive down on the floor, you have the ability to move these things around very readily between hives just from the materials coming in contact with them. Your hive tool is the main thing that is a pathogen transmission mechanism. So washable surfaces, making sure you can sanitize areas. Tool sanitation. Keep your hive tools clean. Easy way to do that. I usually keep a 10% bleach solution in a thing, and I just dump my tools in there when I'm done with them, and then pick out a new one when I'm ready. A quarantine hive area. So this is also something that's a little different about Aja hives. So if you do have a situation with a colony that is very sick, say American foul brood, let's talk about the worst situation possible. Say you get a colony that has American foul brood in it. You have got to do something. Now, number one, you're going to probably remove that whole colony and get it out somewhere, but you've got to have somewhere to quarantine these things. And you don't likely want to keep them in the same area because the bees hives are very close together. So the bees are coming into contact with one another as they're outside of the colony. And so you want to make sure that you do have an area designated if something goes wrong. That can be a Langstroth colony that you're dropping these frames into, or something like that that's at a distant location or away from the hive house. But you do want to have some sort of a plan if something does come up. Replaceable floor mats, and by this I mean cardboard, and you can see that in this picture here. Cardboard is awesome underneath Aja hives. So you're going to not only be working frames, but there's going to be burr comb that's going to be coming off of them. There's going to be stuff dripping down. You're in heavy nectar flow, and it's really wet nectar, and it's just dripping out of the frames. These are all kind of things that you can, get really gooey with very quickly. And so just keeping your boxes. I've got a whole stack of folded boxes in my garage specifically for this. Throw a box down, lay a box flat right underneath your work area. You can get it as sticky as you want, and then you just pick up the thing and throw it in the burn pile or throw it in the recycling after you're done with that. So easy thing to keep in mind. And if you're going to use these hive houses, for beekeeping, you might as well think about other things because you can do a lot of different things with these. We use our bee house for education. This is what we used to do with a lot of our beekeeping education around therapy is we did everything outside, but a lot of times we'd get rained out or things like that. So now we have a place to do things no matter what the weather is. Apitourism, which is basically bee tourism, is really big in a lot of areas of the world and is coming to the United States. We get a lot of folks that just come up here just to experience bees. So that's something you can use the house for. Nature-based therapies, there's some of the stuff that we do. So counseling, apitherapy, yoga with bees, my wife teaches in the house. So those are things that you can also think about to also add more utility to your bee house. Okay, so we're going to wrap up today with the real world example, which is Beewise Farms, my farm, and what we ended up doing. Now, this is kind of we normally are running anywhere from 50 to 100 hives. We produce a lot of nukes. We raise queens all season long. So this is kind of for someone like myself that's been beekeeping for a long time, I wanted to have something that was big enough to have at least 10 hives in. And so this might be a little bigger than what you're thinking, but at least it gives you an idea of kind of what to think about. So this is the building that we purchased. It's a 10 by 20 prefabricated building. It was uninsulated and unfinished. And with delivery, the cost was $7,200. So that's the building. We went ahead and insulated everything with R13. That was about $400 in insulation. This is all work I did myself. So we didn't hire anybody out to do this, but this is the material costs. So $400 in insulation. Flooring, we did a waterproof laminate flooring, and we did that specifically because we wanted to make sure that we can sanitize everything. You do see a carpet or a rug there. That rug gets folded back when we're working bees, but it does look nice when we're not. So that's in there as well, but the flooring was about $1,000. The finish work. So this is going to probably vary pretty severely depending on what your situation is. We had access to a lot of rough sawn wood that was milled here on our farm by the owners previous to us. So all of the wood that you see that's paneling this building was actually milled on this property about 20 to 30 years ago. So we didn't actually have an interior cost for all of that. The only cost we had was electrical outlets and wiring. But I kind of averaged what it would be if you were to drywall. It's probably going to be, I don't know, five, six, $700, maybe $1,000. If you were going to do, a tongue and groove cedar or something like that, it's going to cost more. But I ballparked this at about $1,000. All right, the Aja hives themselves. So this is basically how we installed in our building. So we bought the building, and then basically I framed out what was going to be needed for the hives, and then cut a hole in the side of the building, and then basically filled the hives with them. So we did 10 medless hives from AZ Hives North America. If you are interested in buying these hives, the medless hives are really good hives. The nice thing about AZ Hives North America is the frames that are in these hives are US specs. So they're US deeps. What that means is if you were to buy something straight from Slovenia that is not US spec frames, the frames are going to be a little narrower and a little taller. So they're not going to fit US foundation at all. And that's what's really nice about AZ Hives North America is the owner worked with Medless to basically create a Slovenian-made AZ hive for North America using our foundation specs. So we got 10 of those. They're 30 frame hives, and that's what you see I'm stacking right here. Those were $9,000, so $900 a piece for those hives. They are not cheap hives as far as cost. I will say that the woodenware, though, is far superior to what we can get in the United States as far as the quality of the wood. The hives are made of spruce, and it is very high quality spruce. We also bought five 7-frame medless nukes. They do 7-frame nukes in Slovenia, and those were 1425. So that was what that cost. So for the total build cost, just to give you an idea of this type of an investment, and this is our building right here. You can see the outside and the inside right here. This was a little over $20,000. And so not an inexpensive venture. If you've been beekeeping for any length of time, you probably have $20,000 worth of equipment and bees at this point. I know, we've got hundreds and hundreds of hive bodies and thousands and thousands of frames for Langstroth systems. And so, this was a big investment, but this is the type of investment I looked at it this way. I'm not going to stop beekeeping. Beekeeping has been my life for well, the last 20 years, and it's not going anywhere. And so that's something that I truly want to have as part of my life for the rest of my life. And this is the way I'm going to do that, is making sure that I have something that's fully accessible for my disability needs. And this absolutely hits that mark. All right, let's talk about common mistakes real quick. Number one, poor ventilation. So if you seal this up tight, say, I've had some people that have talked to me about like what other kind of buildings could I use? Like a shipping container is what that people have thrown at me. What if I could just use a shipping container, take the back doors off and just put the hives right in there? Well, that's fine, but you need to have ventilation. So you're gonna have to cut holes in there, maybe put a window in. That's fine too if you can do that. Or if you have somebody that makes those, but that might be an option. But you want to make sure that you have good ventilation. Narrow aisles, making the back area behind the hives too narrow. Don't do that. You got to keep in mind that you can have a door that opens up that's about, I think it's about 19 inches, that door is going to open up. So you already got, that. You can take the doors off of some of these models. The Medalist hives, you can take the doors off, but that's something to keep in mind. You want to give yourself enough space. Cheap materials. If you build it cheap, it's not going to last, and you're investing a tremendous amount of money. If you're buying the hives, you're investing a tremendous amount of money in these hives. Make sure that you're doing this justice and using good materials so that this lasts a long time. This is not like buying new hive bodies and painting them and having a whole new set of equipment. This is a one-time investment, and then basically for the rest of your beekeeping activities with this Aja house, the only thing you're going to have to replace is frames. So you're not going to be replacing hive bodies and things like that like we do with Langstroth equipment when it wears out. Just make sure you're building this appropriately. And poor drainage planning. You do not want to put this building in someplace soggy or wet or any of that kind of stuff. Put it high and dry so you make sure you're not dealing with all of that at some point in the season. And final thoughts on this. So prioritize ergonomics. You're developing this, like I said, you're not going to buy this out of the box. You're not going to buy this from Home Depot or anything like that. You're going to have to, even if you do buy a prefab building, you're going to have to do some modifications and some custom work yourself. So you have the ability to prioritize this early on. Like when you're setting the height of your hives, pay attention to where you want to be working from. Do I want to be standing when I'm working these hives? Do I want to be sitting? What level should I put them at if I am sitting? Do I work from a wheelchair? Where should this be if I'm working from a wheelchair? Because once you set it, that's going to be set for a while. Like you put a hole in that wall, that is the hole that's staying in that wall, right? So build for moisture control also when you're building your buildings. Integrate accessibility technologies like we talked about, ramps, grab handles, things like that. Design for the long term and really make it your own. I think that's one of the beautiful things about this type of work is that you can make this truly your own. All right, so I'm going to wrap up with a couple just educational opportunities for you if you're interested, and then I'll get to the couple questions that we have here from Elizabeth and Trent. And if anybody else has questions, please feel free to drop those in the chat. All right, so first educational opportunity is Heroes to Hives. If you're unfamiliar with this program, we are the ones who are hosting this. And so Heroes to Hives is a beekeeping education course that is completely free, that was set up specifically for veterans and military service personnel are who the course was made for, but it is available to everybody. It's intended for those who are new to beekeeping, and it does offer a certificate of completion at the end of it. So if you decide you want to get a certificate of completion, you can do that. The course is now housed on our YouTube channel. So it used to be that you had to sign up for the course annually. Now you just go to Heroes to Hives, our YouTube channel, right there, and you just hit the courses tab, and there'll be two courses underneath that tab. The first one is Heroes to Hives Beginning Beekeeping course. You can click the View Full Course, and you can go through all 71 offerings in that course. And then we also have the Be Calm, Be Well training course. That is a professional development course for clinical staff of the VA and folks who work with veterans and both beekeeping educators on some of the therapeutic work that we do with honeybees. All right, the next educational opportunity is at Bee Wise Farms. That's my personal farm. If you live in a northern climate, this is specifically for northern beekeepers above the 45th parallel. It is a course very similar in development as far as the format to Heroes to Hives, but it's completely different curriculum. It's intended for people under 5 years, about 20 hours of content. You can find that on our YouTube channel, Bee Wise Farms, and just hit the courses tab, and it's under that and is totally free. All right. If you are looking to actually get experience working with me and some of these Aja hives or alternative hives, we are actually hosting a workshop in August 15th, from 1 to 4 p.m. Eastern on alternative hives. We'll be covering the Aja hives, so we'll be working these hives right here in this picture. We will be covering long Langstroth hives and Kenyan top bar hives and how to overwinter Kenyan top bar hives, which is pretty darn tricky. So if you're interested in that, bewisefarms.com, you can find those workshops. Those are a fee-based workshop. And then the last thing that I have here is our Be Calm, Be Well facilitator training. That is an offering that we have co-developed with the VA, so the Department of Veterans Affairs. And basically, we have two on-ground trainings for this. This will cover 9 evidence-based practices, which are basically mindfulness practices incorporated into a bee yard. Like you see here, these folks are doing a mindful meditation while actively working a beehive. So that if you're interested in that kind of thing, we're targeting beekeeping educators and clinical staff at this point. We have Bay Mills Community College up here in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, July 15th through the 16th, and the University of Missouri Jefferson Farm. That one is September 16th and 17th in Columbia, Missouri. So those are the offerings that we have for you. And I'll put the last slide up here.